Chapter 15. The fact that people are poor or just discriminated against doesn't necessarily endow them with any special qualities of justice, nobility, charity, or compassion. Saul Alinsky. To squelch any possibility of the angels roaring drunkenly out of camp during the night, Baxter and the Highway Patrol announced a 10 p.m. curfew. At that time, anyone in camp would have to stay, and nobody else could come in. This was made official just after dark. The deputies were still trying to be friendly, and they assured the angels that the curfew was as much for their protection as anything else. They kept talking about bunches of townspeople coming through the woods with deer rifles. To forestall this, the police set up a command post at the point where the Willow Cove trail joined the highway. Meanwhile, a mountain of six-packs was piling up in the middle of camp. This was in addition to the original 22 cases in my car. By the time it got dark, the car was half empty, so I put the rest of the beer in the back seat and locked my own gear in the trunk. I decided that any symbolic alienation I might incur by securing my valuables was worth the risk of having them all lost, which they probably would have been, for it was not long before the camp became like an animal pen. A reporter from the Los Angeles Times showed up the next day and said it looked like Dante's Inferno, but he arrived about noon, when most of the outlaws were calm and stupefied from the ravages of the previous night. If the midday lull seemed that awful, the bonfire scenes might have permanently damaged his mind. Or perhaps not, for the 10 o'clock curfew had a drastic effect on the action. By driving all the fringe elements out of camp, it forced the angels to fall back on their own entertainment resources. Most of those who left were girls. They had seemed to be enjoying things until the deputies announced that they would either leave by the deadline or stay all night. The implications were not pleasant. At 10, the law was going to pull out, seal off the area, and let the orgy begin. All afternoon, the scene had been brightened by 6 or 10 loads of young girls from places like Fresno and Modesto and Merced, who had somehow got wind of the gathering and apparently wanted to make a real party of it. It never occurred to the angels that they would not stay the night, or the whole weekend for that matter, so it came as a bad shock when they left. The 3 nurses who picked up Larry, Pete, and Puff earlier in the day made a brave decision to stay. But then, at the last moment, they fled. "Man, I can't stand it," said one angel, as he watched the last of the cars lurch off down the trail. All that fine pussy just wasted. The wiggy little thing with the red shoes was all mine. We were grooving. How could she just split? It was a rotten show by almost any standards. Here were all these high-bottomed wenches in stretch pants and sleeveless blouses, all half unbuttoned, beehive hairdos, and blue-lidded eyes, ripe, ignorant little bodies talking horny all afternoon. "Oh, Beth, don't these bikes just drive you kind of wild?" "Yeah, baby, wild for the open road." And off they went, like nuns hearing the whistle, while the grief-stricken angels just stood there and watched. Many had left their own women behind, fearing trouble, but now that the trouble was dissipated, there was not going to be any strange Gench either. Among the hardest hit was Terry the Tramp, who immediately loaded up on LSD and spent the next 12 hours locked in the back of a panel truck shrieking and crying under the gaze of some god he had almost forgotten, but who came down that night to the level of the treetops and just stared. Man, he just looked at me. And I tell you, I was scared like a little kid. Other angels rushed off to the beer market when the curfew was first announced, but their hopes for a party with the tourists was dashed when the place closed on the dot of 10. There was nothing to do but go back to camp and get wasted. The police were lenient with late arrivals, but once in, there was no getting out. The hours between 10 and 12 were given over to massive consumption. Around 11, I ducked into the car and worked for a while on the tape, but my monologue was constantly interrupted by people reaching through the back windows and trying to wrench the trunk open. For hours, there had been so much beer in camp that nobody worried about seeing the end of it, but suddenly it all disappeared. Instead of one beer at a time, everybody who reached into the car took a six-pack. The stash had begun. It was like a run on a bank. Within minutes, the back seat was empty. There were still 20 or 30 six-packs piled up near the bonfire, but these weren't for stashing. The cans were clipped off one at a time. Nobody wanted to start a run on the public beer stock. It would have been very bad form. And if the hoarding became too obvious, those who planned to drink all night might get violent. By this time, various drug reactions were getting mixed up with the booze, and there was no telling what any one person might do. Wild shouts and explosions burst through the darkness. Now and then come the sound of a body plunging into the lake, a splash, then yelling and kicking in the water. The only light was the bonfire, a heap of logs and branches about 10 feet wide and 5 feet tall. It lit up the whole clearing and gleamed on the headlights and handlebars of the big Harleys, parked on the edge of the darkness. In the wavering orange light, it was hard to see faces, except those right next to you. Bodies became silhouettes, only the voices were the same. There were about 50 girls in camp, but nearly all were old ladies, not to be confused, except at serious risk, with mamas or strange chicks. An old lady can be a steady girlfriend, a wife, or even some body hustler that one of the outlaws has taken a liking to. Whatever the connection, she is presumed to be spoken for, and unless she makes obvious signs to the contrary, she will usually be left alone. The angels are very solemn about this, insisting that no member would think of violating the sanctity of another's liaison. This is true, but only up to a point. Unlike wolves, old ladies don't mate for life, and sometimes not even for a month. Many are legally married, with several children, and exist entirely apart from the general promiscuity. Others are borderline cases who simply change their minds now and then. They switch loyalties without losing rank, establishing just as firm a relationship with one angel as they previously had with another. These can be very shifting sands, like beauty and honesty. Promiscuity is in the eyes of the beholder, at least among the angels. An old lady who changes her mind once too often, or perhaps only once, will find herself classified as a mama, which means she is common property. There are mamas at any angel gathering, large or small. They travel as part of the troop, like oxpeckers, fully understanding what's expected. They are available at any time, in any way, to any angel, friend or favored guest, individually or otherwise. They also understood that the minute they don't like the arrangement, they can leave. Most hang around for a few months, then drift on to something else. A few have been around for years, but this kind of dedication requires an almost predator-human tolerance for abuse and humiliation. The term mama is all that remains of the original expression, let's go make somebody a mama, which was later shortened to let's go make a mama. Other fraternities have different ways of saying it, but the meaning is the same. A girl who's always available. A widely quoted section of the Lynch report says these girls are called sheep, but I have never heard an angel use that word. It sounds like the creation of some police inspector with intensely rural memories. The mamas aren't pretty, although some of the newer and younger ones have a sort of demented beauty that erodes so fast that you have to see it happen over a period of months to feel any sense of tragedy. Once the girls have developed the proper perspective, it's easy to take them for granted. One night in Sacramento, the Angels ran out of beer money and decided to auction off Mama Lorraine in a bar. The top bid was 12 cents, and the girl laughed along with the others. On another occasion, Magoo was packing Mama Beverly on a run to Bakersfield when he ran out of gas. Do you know, he recalls, I couldn't find a single gas station attendant who would give me a free gallon of gas for a go-atter. The public prints are full of testimony by men who take pride in having sold their talents dearly. But people who understand that their only talent is not worth 15 cents or a gallon of gas are not often quoted. Nor do they usually leave diaries. It would be interesting to hear, sometime, just exactly what it feels like to go up on the auction block, willing to serve any purpose, and get knocked down for 12 cents. Most mamas don't think about it, much less talk. Their conversation ranges from gossip and raw innuendo to fending off jibes and haggling over small amounts of money. But every now and then, one of them will rap off something eloquent. Donna, a stocky, good-natured brunette, who came north with the exodus from Bordeaux, once put the whole thing in a nut. Everybody believes in something, she said. Some people believe in God. I believe in the angels. Each chapter has a few mamas, but only Oakland maintains as many as 5 or 6 at a time. Among other outlaw clubs, the situation varies. The Gypsy Jokers are not as mama-oriented as the Angels, but the Satan's slaves are so keen on the practice that they take their communal women down to the tattoo parlor and have property of Satan's slaves etched permanently on the left rump cheek. The slaves feel that branding gives the girls a sense of security and belonging. It erases any doubt about peer group acceptance. The branded individual is said to experience powerful and instantaneous sensations of commitment, of oneness with the organization, and those few who have taken the step form a special elite. The Angels are not given to branding their women, but the practice will probably catch on, because some of them think it shows real class. But it takes the right girl, said one. She has to really mean it. Some girls won't go for it. You know, like who wants to go to the baby doctor with a big tattoo saying, your ass belongs to the Satan's slaves? Or what if a girl wants to cop out sometime and get married? Men imagine the wedding night. Man, imagine the wedding night. She drops her nightie and there it is. Wow. There were about 20 slaves at Bass Lake, but they didn't do much mixing. They staked out a small corner of the clearing, parked their bikes around it, and spent most of the weekend lying around with their women and drinking their own wine. The Gypsy Jokers were less inhibited, but their behavior was oddly subdued in the presence of so many Hells Angels. Unlike the slaves, few of the Jokers had brought girls, so they were spared the constant worry that some pill-crazed angel might try to move in and provoke a fight that the Angels would have to win. In theory, the Hells Angels Confederation is friendly with all other outlaws, but in practice, the half-dozen Angels chapters clash frequently with various clubs around their own turf. In San Francisco, the Jokers and the Angels nurse a long-standing enmity, but the Jokers get along famously with other Angels chapters. A similar situation prevailed for years in the Los Angeles area, where the Purdue Angels had sporadic rumbles with the slaves, Comancheros, and coffin cheaters. Yet these three clubs continue to speak well of every Hells Angel in the state, except those dirty bastards from Purdue, who kept muscling on other people's turf. All this was changed, however, by the Monterey rape, which resulted in such overwhelming heat that the Purdue Angels were forced into desperate coexistence with the slaves and other LA clubs, who were not much better off. The Satan slaves are still a power in outlaw circles, but they have lost their slashing style of the early 1960s. Other outlaws say the slaves have never recovered from the loss of Smacky Jack, their legendary president, who had so much class that even the Angels held him slightly in awe. Smacky Jack stories still circulate when the clan gets together. I first heard about him from an easygoing Sacramento Angel named Norbit. Man, that Jack was out of sight. Sometimes he'd run wild for 3 or 4 days on pills and wine. He carried a pair of rusty pliers around with him, and we'd sick him on strange broads. Man, he'd jerk them down to the ground and start pulling their teeth out with those goddamn pliers. I was with him in a place one time when the waitress wouldn't give us any coffee. Jack climbed right over the counter and took out 3 of her front teeth with his pliers. Some of the things he did would turn your stomach. Once he pulled out one of his own teeth in a bar. People couldn't believe it. A lot of them ran out when they saw he was serious. When he finally got the thing out, he laid it down in the bar and asked if he could trade it for a drink. He was spitting blood on the floor, but the bartender was too shook up to say anything. Smacky Jack's turbulent 3-year reign came to an end in 1964. Few of the outlaws seemed to know what happened to him. I heard he took a real bad fall, said one. He pushed his luck about as hard as a guy could. Motorcycle outlaws are reluctant to talk seriously about former buddies who came to a bad end. The implications are too depressing. Smacky Jack, with his penchant for freelance dentistry, was not the type to retire peacefully. Whatever happened, whether he was jailed, killed, or forced to flee anonymously, he existed in outlaw legend as a rollicking, unpredictable monster who always prevailed. His loss was a demoralizing blow to the Satan's slaves, whose spirit was already faltering under continued police pressure. By the end of 1964, the club was on the verge of disbanding. The slaves, along with several of the Hells Angels chapters, were saved from extinction by the Lynch Report and the nationwide infamy that followed. It gave the outlaws something to live up to, but they could never make it big unless they stopped fighting among themselves. Barger was among the first to realize this, and the other clubs were not far behind. Their struggle for equality was suddenly rendered futile. The publicity breakthrough gave the Angels such prestige that the other clubs had no choice but to get on the bandwagon or perish. The process of consolidation took most of 1965, and it was only in the first stages at the time of the Bass Lake run. Of the dozen or so functioning outlaw clubs in the state, only the Jokers and the Slaves felt confident enough to show up at Bass Lake in significant strength. Individual Angel chapters might have lost their supremacy, but when all of them got together, there was no question about who had the action. All things considered, it was a nervous time for the slaves. to show up with their women, who tend toward a wispy, blondish prettiness, a tempting sight for any Hell's Angel brooding drunkenly on the whys and wherefores of an unjust sex ratio. By 11, it was plain that every girl in camp was not only spoken for, but taken. Off in the bushes, there were sounds of giggling and groaning and twigs snapping, but the 100 or so outlaws who remained around the bonfire were discreetly oblivious. Many had worked off excess energy in the traditional war games. On some earlier run, they had formed 2 secret battle societies, the Lodge and U-Boat 13. At any moment, at the sound of a prearranged signal, the U-Boat mob would rush on some hapless Lodge partisan, crushing him under a pile of bodies. Other Lodgers would then come to the rescue, adding to the pileup. It looked like a scramble for a loose ball in a game between the Chicago Bears and the Green Bay Packers. Except at Bass Lake, the human heaps involved 50 or 60 people. I remember seeing Puff, who weighed about 225, sprint for about 20 yards and dive headfirst into the pile with a beer in each hand. For some reason, there were no injuries. The Outlaws are not athletic in the sense that any are ex-lettermen, but nearly all of them stay in good shape. They don't work at it, but the way most of them live, they don't have to. What work they get paid for is usually physical anyway, and when they're not working, they exist on hamburgers, donuts, and whatever else they can hustle. Many swell up with beer, and the swelling bears little resemblance to the stylish pot of the desk-bound world. Even the few fat angels are built more like beer barrels than water balloons. There are those who claim the outlaws don't need food because they get all their energy from pep pills, but this is a bit far-fetched. The substitution doesn't work. As anyone who ever tried it can tell you, there are drugs to stimulate latent energy, but they are worthless and invigorating unless the energy is there in the first place. Taken in excess on an empty stomach, pep pills induce a kind of nervous stupor characterized by fatigue, depression, chills, and soaking sweats. The Angels deal freely on the black market, and if any pill really worked as a substitute for food, they would use it in large quantities, but it would vastly simplify their lives. As it is, they take their nourishment wherever they can. Girls cook for them, waitresses give them credit at greasy diners, and there are always the married men whose wives rarely balk at feeding 5 or 6 of the brethren at any hour of the day or night. According to the code, there is no such thing as one angel imposing on another. A hungry outlaw will always be fed by one of the others who has food. And if times are lean all around, a foraging party will hit a supermarket and steal everything they can carry. Few clerks will try to stop a dangerous hoodlum rushing out the door with 2 hams and 3 quarts of milk. The outlaws are not apologetic about stealing food, even though it goes against their pride. They prefer to think they don't have to, but whenever they do, they aren't sneaky. While one is gathering hams or steaks, another will create a disturbance to draw the clerks. A third will fill a rucksack full of cans and vegetables on the other side of the store. And then they will all flee at the same time through different exits. There's nothing difficult about it. All it takes is gall, a threatening appearance, and a surly disregard for whatever the neighbors might think. As for the police, by the time they reach the scene of the crime, the food is already being cooked 20 blocks away. The outlaws are not articulate when it comes to the strengths and weaknesses of the world they function in, but their instincts are finely honed. They have learned from experience that some crimes are likely to be punished, and some aren't. A Hell's Angel who wants to make a long-distance call, for instance, will usually go to a payphone, He will deposit enough money for the first 3 minutes, acknowledge the operator's signal at the end of that time, and talk for as long as he wants. When he finally finishes, the operator will tell him how many coins he should put in the black box. But instead of paying, he laughs, spits obscenities into the phone, and hangs up. Unlike the normal middle-class, hard-working American, a motorcycle outlaw has no vested interest in the system that is represented by the voice of a telephone operator. The values of that system are completely irrelevant to him. He doesn't give a damn. And besides, he knows the phone company can't catch him. So he completes his call, abuses the operator, and goes off to get happily wasted. Chapter 16. The psychopath, like the child, cannot delay the pleasures of gratification, and this trait is one of his underlying universal characteristics. He cannot wait upon erotic gratification, which convention demands should be preceded by the chase before the kill. He must rape. He cannot wait upon the development of prestige in society. His egotistic ambition leads him to leap into headlines by daring performances. Like a red thread, the predominance of this mechanism for immediate satisfaction runs through the history of every psychopath. It explains not only his behavior, but also the violent nature of his acts. Robert Lindner, Rebel Without a Cause. On a run, everybody gets wasted. As midnight approached, the Willow Cove campsite took on an air of bedlam. People with glazed eyes wandered into the lake and sat down. Others fell against bikes or shouted meaningless abuse at friends they couldn't recognize. Rather than mix in the deranged traffic around the bonfire, I drifted back to my car on the edge of darkness and joined a group of gypsy jokers. They were still holding back, letting the angels put on the show. Hutch, the spokesman, seemed to have a philosophic bent, and he wanted to talk. Just what was the meaning of this whole goddamn thing about motorcycle gangs? He didn't claim to know, but he wanted to explore it. We aren't really bad, he said, but we aren't good either. Hell, I don't know. Sometimes I like this scene, and sometimes I don't. But the thing that really pisses me off is the newspapers. I don't mind them calling us punks and that kind of stuff. But you know, even when we pulled off some really bad shit, they still get it wrong. When I read those things, I don't even recognize myself. Hell, we should probably kick your ass just for being a reporter. The others chuckled, but it occurred to me that the same remark might spark a different reaction later on, when the drink began to take hold. Yet it seemed that if the outlaws really wanted no part of the press, they would have bounced me out of camp much earlier. Just before dark, Tiny had driven off two cameramen who claimed to be from CBS. And shortly after that, he'd warned me about using the tape recorder, saying he'd throw it in the fire if he saw it. Except posed or prearranged situations, most angels are leery of being photographed or recorded, or even of talking to a man with a notebook. Tapes and film are regarded as especially dangerous, because they can't be denied. This is true even in peaceful situations, where a casual photograph can place a man at the scene of a crime not yet committed. An angel who gets arrested on suspicion of manslaughter in Oakland can always find witnesses to swear he was in San Francisco that night. But he is done for if any newspaper has a photo of him talking to the victim 10 minutes prior to the fatal fight. Tape recordings can also be incriminating, particularly if one of the outlaws gets strung out on booze or pills and begins bragging about what Senator Murphy calls their wild acts in defiance of decency. This has happened. In one instance, Barger took 3 hours of tape from a reporter and went over it carefully, erasing anything that seemed incriminating. Since then, he has passed the word that nobody gives interviews without checking with him first. The jokers don't answer to Barger, however, and at that point, they were eager to get the ear of any journalist who might give them a boost up the status ladder. Hutch is a bright fellow, about 6'2", with thick blonde hair and a face that any Arthur Murray studio would hire on site. He works as a laborer now and then, but only to stay eligible for unemployment insurance, known in outlaw circles as the 5226-26 Club. At 27, he exits on the fringe of the labor market, working only in emergencies. When I saw him several weeks later at his parents' apartment in a prosperous residential district of San Francisco, he talked about motorcycle outlaws with a lazy objectivity that was hard to mesh with his concern for more and better press notices. I was only dimly aware of it then, but after a while I realized that if the outlaws were ever forced to choose between consistently bad and biased publicity or no publicity at all, they wouldn't hesitate to choose the former. While Hutch and I were talking, another joker joined the conversation. He introduced himself as Bruno, or Harpo, or something along those lines, and handed me one of his cards. Many outlaws carry business cards, some of them very elaborate. Frenchie from Frisco hands out shiny black ones with silver lettering. The idea of cards was born when the Frisco Angels, lamenting their rotten image, decided to win the public over to their side by aiding every stranded motorist they could find, and then leaving a card saying, on one side, "You have been assisted by a member of the Hells Angels, Frisco." And on the other, "When we do right, no one remembers. When we do wrong, no one forgets." It was not quite as classy as leaving a silver bullet or a chromed headbolt, but they felt it was better than nothing. For several years, the Frisco Angels made a point of offering their mechanical talents to any motorist with problems. But that was before all the publicity. It would be very risky now. Consider the reaction of a middle-aged roofing and siding salesman cruising along with his wife and 2 children in a family Mustang on a remote stretch of Highway 101. Something in the engine begins to clink, so he pulls onto the shoulder and gets out to look. Suddenly, he hears a rumble of motorcycles. A dozen Hells Angels pull over, get off their bikes, and walk toward him. Thinking quickly, he jerks the oil dipstick out of his engine and begins lashing at the thugs. His wife, terror-stricken, leaps out of the car and runs into a nearby cornfield, weaving through the stalks like a lizard. The children cower. The man is punched, and moments later, a highway patrol car arrives. The outlaws are jailed on $3,000 bond for aggravated assault and attempted rape. A week later, when things are explained and all the charges are dropped, the man apologizes. But each angel is $300 poorer, and the courtesy cards are left at home next time. The outlaws still carry cards, but not the highway variety. Most show only the club emblem, the member's name, and the ever-present 1%er sign. None give printed addresses or phone numbers. These are sometimes written on the back of the cards, but they change so frequently that it's impossible to keep them current. Most of the cards I have contain 3 or 4 phone numbers, nearly all disconnected for non-payment. For some reason, I no longer have Bruno's, or Harpo's, card, but I remember him because he stole a full beer from me. I couldn't quite believe it, for he had gone to great lengths to make sure I didn't have any wrong impressions about the gypsy jokers. From time to time, we would put our beers down on the trunk of the car we were leaning against. Just before he left, I opened a fresh can, put it down, and saw Bruno Harpo exchange it deftly for his own, which was empty. When I mentioned this to Hutch, he shrugged and said it was probably just a habit, one of those tricks you pick up from drinking in bars when you're broke. Habits like these are widespread in outlaw society. The outlaws can be very friendly with outsiders, but not all of them equate friendship with mutual trust. Some will steal senselessly, out of sheer habit or compulsion, while others will take pains to protect a naive outsider against the more light-fingered of the brethren who are not to be pitied or censored, but only watched. There's a story about an angel who went to use the bathroom in the home of a stranger he was visiting. While there, he rummaged through the medicine cabinet and found a bottle of orange pills that looked like dexedrine, which he promptly ate. Later, when he felt sick, he told the host about the pills and sheepishly asked if he might have made a mistake. It developed that he had taken a massive overdose of cortisone, a drug well known for its anti-arthritic properties, unpredictable reactions, and weird side effects. The man whose pills had been eaten was not happy, and told the angel he would probably break out in a rash of boils and running sores that would keep him in agony for weeks. On hearing this, the outlaw nervously retired to whatever bed he was using at the time. The boils never came, but he said he felt sick and weak and queer all over for about 10 days. When he recovered, he said the incident had taught him a valuable lesson. He no longer had to worry about what kind of pills he ate, because his body could handle anything he put into it. The theft of my beer sent me back across the clearing for another. By the time it was obvious to everyone standing around the campfire that the beer mountain was almost gone. Within an hour or so, those with nothing stashed were going to be thirsty. This would cause tension, and the hoarders were among the most insistent that another beer run should be made. Otherwise, they would have to share their stash or fight. Some people were too stoned and wasted to care about beer, but a hard core of about 50 drinkers who intended to stay on their feet all night began the laborious process of getting up a collection. By now the camp was badly disorganized. Barger had disappeared somewhere in the trees, and those remaining around the fire were the least likely to have money. The fact that all the Bass Lake stores were closed was immaterial. Tiny said he had a friend who ran a market out on the highway. He would open the store at any hour of the night if somebody came around the back and rapped on the window of his bedroom. I listened carefully, but because I knew who would have to go get the stuff. The police were not going to let any angels out of the camp, and the only non-angels still around were me and a young boy who had wandered in earlier and was now worried about getting home. Until he announced this, everybody thought he was somebody else's friend, but in fact he was a stowaway. Nobody was particularly anxious to help him get out of camp, but he insisted that he had to meet some friends who were cruising up and down the highway looking for him. For a moment he was standing next to Tiny by the fire, and the contrast was mind-bending. A clean-cut lad about 16, wearing a white t-shirt and chinos, taking the mountain air with a huge, hairy outcast, given over to all forms of depravity, and wearing a patch on his jacket saying, "I'm bound to go to heaven because I've already served my time in hell." Together they looked like figures in some ominous painting, a doomsday portrait of the human animal confronting itself, as if a double-yolked egg had hatched both a chicken and a wildebeest. Tiny would make a good reporter, or an actor's agent. He had a fine sense of contacts, of being in touch with what's happening. Inside dope, the latest. He's an inveterate phone user. Long distance means nothing to him. In Oakland, he has several payphones on which he takes collect calls from Boston, Providence, New York, Philadelphia, and God knows where else. He operates like a master criminal, always checking the action, the chances, the possibilities. When he sits down in a bar, he faces the door, while other angels drink and talk aimlessly. Tiny broods about unreachable contacts, unreported action, and all the loose ends that might come unraveled at any moment. He is 6'5", and his weight varies between 250 and 270, depending on his frame of mind, which gyrates so wildly that he is probably the most dangerous of the angels, and also one of the best humored. Others are quicker to fight, but they don't cause half as much damage. Tiny hurts people. When he loses his temper, he goes completely out of control, and his huge body becomes a lethal weapon. It is difficult to see what role he might play in the great society. While the beer collection was being taken up, the headlights of a car came poking through the trees. A few bikes had come in since 10, but this was the first car, and the sight of it caused a stir. It turned out to be the Filthy Phil, an ex-president of the Frisco chapter. Filthy Phil, an ex-president of the Frisco chapter, who explained that he'd hidden a 15-year-old girl on the highway, and needed some help to get her past the roadblock. This gelled things. It was decided to do everything at once. Phil and I would go for the beer, try to get the boy past the roadblock on the way out, and take Pete and Puff to a point in the woods where they could locate the girl. Phil was looking anything but filthy. He was wearing dress slacks, a white shirt, and a blue cashmere sweater. He'd had a hard time getting into camp, he said, because the cops wouldn't believe he was an angel. He looked more like an off-duty cop, or maybe a brawny bouncer from some club on the Sunset Strip. His car, a new white Chevrolet Impala, was as out of place as his clothes. About 50 yards short of the highway, he pointed out where the girl was hiding, and the two angels went off through the woods to get her. We continued along the trail to the roadblock. There were 3 cars and at least 10 cops, with a white-haired highway patrol captain in charge. Our stowaway was sitting in the back seat, and just as the captain began asking us what we were up to, another car came by, and the boy shouted, "That's them! That's them!" I reached over and blew the horn. The other car stopped. The boy leapt out, and seconds later he was gone. The police thought something had been put over on them. "You mean that kid was in there all this time?" one asked. "Was he hurt? What's going on in there?" "Nothing," I said. "It's dull. Go and see for yourself. You'll be surprised." The captain, who'd been mulling over the bogus press credentials I'd given him, then told us we couldn't leave. A long argument ensued, having to do with freedom of the press, a citizen's right to buy beer at any legal hour, and the possibility that the angels might go looking for beer on their own hook if we returned back. "Where would you buy it?" the captain asked. "All the places are closed." "We'll go as far as we have to," I said. "There's plenty of time." They had a quick huddle and then said we could go, thinking no doubt that we'd drive 60 miles to Madeira to find an open bar. As we left, one of the cops smiled and said, "Have a good trip." 10 minutes later, we parked beside what appeared to be Tiny's friend's market, but it was hard to be sure. It was farther away than he'd said, and much bigger than his description. Because of this, I was a little hesitant to go around the back and start rapping on dark windows. If we had the wrong market, it could be a serious mistake. But it seemed worth a try, so I rapped, keeping ready to sprint around the corner at the first sound of a gun being cocked. Nobody answered, so I rapped again. At any instant, I expected to hear a woman shrieking, Henry, they're here! Oh God, they've come for us! Shoot, Henry, shoot! And even if Henry didn't blow my head off, he'd be sure to call the police, and we'd be busted for attempted burglary, trying to crash a beer market in the dead of night. Finally, I heard a movement inside, and somebody yelled, "Who is it?" "A friend of Tiny's," I said quickly. "We need beer." The light came on, and a friendly face appeared. The man came out in his bathrobe and opened the store. He didn't seem at all upset. "Yeah, good old Tiny," he said. "He's real gas, ain't he?" I agreed, and gave him the $35 the Angels had collected around the fire. Phil added $5 more, and we left with 8 cases. The man held Tiny in such high esteem that he charged only $125 a six-pack instead of the $150 we'd paid at the other place. When we got back to the roadblock, the captain flashed his lights in the car and seemed shocked to see the beer. "We've been gone less than half an hour." "Where did you get it?" he asked. "Down the road," I said. He shook his head glumly and waved us into the cab. Obviously, some dirty work was afoot. I felt a little sorry for him. Here he was, standing on the highway all night, sworn to protect the citizens of Bass Lake, and the very people most likely to suffer looting if the Hells Angels ran wild were helping to get the hoodlums drunk. We were received in camp with cheers and shouting. Our 8 cases made the nut. The hoarders wisely fell back on their own stash. And sometime around 4, a big contingent from the south rolled in with several more cases. The rest of the night was more a question of endurance than enjoyment. Magoo, a 26-year-old teamster from Oakland, stayed by the fire and kept stoking. When somebody warned him not to burn everything up on the first night, he replied, "What the hell? There's a whole forest. We've got plenty of firewood." Magoo is one of the most interesting of the Angels because his mind seems wholly immune to the notions and tenets of 20th century American life. Like most of the others, he is a high school dropout, but his gig with the Teamsters gives him a decent income, and he doesn't have much to worry about. He drives a truck whenever he gets the call, sometimes 6 days a week, and sometimes only 1. And he says he enjoys the work, especially after a long layoff. One night in Oakland, he showed up wearing a white shirt under his colors and seemed very pleased with himself. "I did some righteous work today for the first time in a long time," he said. "I unloaded 35,000 pounds of frozen chickens. Even stole one. It made me feel good to do some work for a change." Magoo is a pill freak, and when he gets wired up, he does a lot of talking. Despite his Cro-Magnon appearance, he has a peculiar dignity that can only be dealt with on its own terms. He is easily insulted, but unlike some of the others, he distinguishes between accidental insults and those which are obviously intentional. Instead of bashing people he doesn't like, in the style of Fat Freddy, a heavy-set Mexican, the Oakland chapter's Punch-Out artist, Magoo will simply turn his back on them. His opinions are flavored with a morality that seems more instinctive than learned. He is very earnest, and although much of his talk is weird and rambling, it is shot through with riffs of something like primitive Christianity and a strong dose of Darwin. Magoo started the Porterville riot in 1963. He was the one who, according to the news magazines, mercilessly beat the old man in the tavern. Here's Magoo's version. "I was sitting there at the end of a horseshoe bar, just drinking beer and minding my own business, when this old bastard came up, picking up my beer and threw it in my face. 'What the hell?' I yelled, and I stood up quick. 'Uh-oh,' says the guy. I made a mistake. So I clipped him with a right, and he stumbled. Then another, and he was going down. Then I finished him off with another punch and left him there on the floor. That's all. Well, what would you do if some son of a bitch threw a beer in your face? One night in Oakland, Magoo and I got into a long conversation about guns. I expected the usual crap about dum-dums and shootouts and cooling guys with a rod, but Magoo talked more like a candidate for the Olympic pistol team. When I casually mentioned man-sized targets, he snapped, "Don't tell me about shooting at people. I'm talking about matchsticks." And he was. He shoots a Ruger 22 revolver, an expensive long-barreled precision-made gun that no hood would ever consider. And on days when he isn't working, he goes out to the dump and tries to shoot the heads off matchsticks. It's hard as hell, he says. Now and then I'll do it just right, and light one. Magoo is more self-contained than most of the angels. He is one of the few who doesn't mind telling you his real name. He is married to a quiet, ripe-looking girl named Lynn, but he seldom takes her to any angel party that might get wild. Usually he comes alone and doesn't say much unless he decides to drop some pills, which causes him to rave like Lord Buckley. At Bass Lake, he tended the fire with the single-minded zeal of a man who had been eating bennies like popcorn. The flames lit up his glasses and his Nazi helmet. Earlier in the day, he had chopped his Levi's at knee level with a hunting knife, exposing his thick white legs, for about 10 inches before they disappeared again into black motorcycle boots. The effect was an obscene mockery of Bermuda shorts. Sometime before dawn, I was standing by the fire and listening to Magoo make one of his classy propositions. He was talking to two other angels and a girl, trying to convince them, "Let's the four of us go off in the bushes," he said. "We'll smoke up some weed, get all fucked up, feel no fucking pain. And if she wants to lay somebody body on us, why not?" He waited a moment, but there was no reply, so he continued, "You're an angel, aren't you? I never manhandled you, did I? Never given you a hard time? So what's wrong? Let's go over to the bushes and smoke up some weed. She's an angel woman. Hell, she should swing." At that moment, without waiting for a reply, Magoo turned slightly at the hip, not moving his feet, and urinated into the fire. There was a loud hiss as some of the embers went black. The stench caused people to move away. Perhaps he meant it as a mating signal, a carnal gesture designed to strip away all pretense. But all it did was queer his act. The angel whose woman was being hustled had not been happy with the situation, and Magoo's mindless indulgence of his bladder gave the others a good excuse to drift off, seeking an upwind position. Sometime later, on the other side of the fire, I heard two angels several feet behind me. They were sitting on the ground, leaning up against one of the bikes and talking very seriously while they passed a joint back and forth. I listened for a moment, keeping my back to them, but all I heard was one emphatic sentence. Man, I'd give all the weed in the world to clear up the mess in my head. I quickly moved away, hoping I hadn't been recognized. At my car, I found several people rummaging through the back seat, looking for beer. They had been out in the woods for a while and hadn't realized that another delivery had come in. One of these was the inscrutable Ray, president of the Fresno chapter. Not even the angels understand Ray. He is too friendly with outsiders. He introduces himself formally and always shakes hands. There's nothing threatening about him except perhaps his size. About 6'3" and 200 pounds. His blonde hair is short by angel standards, and his face is as wholesome as the cover on a Boy Scout handbook. Some of the outlaws call him a socialite, implying that his connection with the angels is more dilettantish than desperate, which is probably true. Ray gives the impression of having options, so the others assume he'll eventually cop out for something with more of a future, something like stoop labor or a steady job in a grease pit. Ray is 25 and enjoys being an angel, but he is not entirely committed, and because of this, he's a bone in the throat of those outlaws who don't have even the illusion of an option. If Ray moved to Oakland, he would have to show some really fiendish class before he could get into Barger's chapter. He'd have to beat up a cop in public or rape a waitress on the counter of her own hash house. Only then, after burning his bridges back to the square world, would he be welcome in the Legion of the Damned. But Ray is content to stay in Fresno, where he stages wild parties and does a booming trade in motorcycles. He is such a bike zealot that the angels in both LA and the Bay Area use him as a sort of clearinghouse. He travels constantly and always on his hog. One weekend, he will be at the Blue Blazes bar in Fontana, checking on the Purdue action. And on the next, he'll turn up at the Luau or the Sinners Club in Oakland, cheerfully giving advice, shaking hands and trying to organize a party. At the first height of the civil rights upheaval in Alabama, Ray rode his bike all the way to Selma, not to march, but just to see what was happening. I thought maybe them niggers was getting out of hand, he explained with a smile. So I just went down to check on them. When Ray met Bill Murray in Fontana, he learned he was doing an article for the Saturday Evening Post. He invited him to Fresno and gave him specific instructions on how to make the connection. When you get to town, he said, go out to Blackstone Avenue until you find Ratcliffe Stadium. Ask for me in the filing station across the street. I'm sometimes hard to find, but they'll know where I am. But something went wrong, and Murray spent half a day futilely checking leads, which were all false. Because Ray's human antenna took Murray for a cop. He did, however, locate a house where the Fresno Angels had recently staged a party. It made such an impression on him that he quickly left town. Here's the way he described it. The house was set back 100 or 200 yards from Blackstone Avenue, which is the main road north of Yosemite, and it was just one of many similar ones in the neighborhood. A one-story white-frame, three-room bungalow with a tiny front yard and a general air of dilapidation. Nonetheless, it was hard to miss. Part of the fence had been flattened. All of the windows had been smashed. One of the fence posts had been rammed through a door, and the branches of two small trees in the front yard had been torn away from the trunks and dragged grotesquely on the ground. Between them, an armchair sprawled face down, gutted, its arms smashed. On the back of the chair, written in red ink, were the words, Hell's Angels, 1369er, D. Bertu. I went into the house and stood in the center of what must once have been the living room. It was hard to tell, because I had never seen such utter chaos. Every piece of furniture had been smashed. Debris littered the floors, broken glass, torn clothing, empty cans, wine and beer bottles, crockery, boxes. Every door had been ripped off its hinges, and a large hole gaped where an air conditioner had been torn away and carted off. The word "cops" had been scrawled in large red letters over a caved-in bed, and used as a target for bottles and anything else that had come to hand. Under it was written, "Yeah, Fresno," over another swastika. All the walls had been defaced. The immediate neighbors were respectable people whose houses were not more than a few yards away. They said that the house had been rented to a single girl who had seemed all right. The next morning, the motorcyclists had started to arrive. There must have been 20 or 25 of them, including their girls, and their party lasted nearly 2 weeks, until the police had finally come without being summoned. No one had protested or called for help. The man who lived directly in back of the house, and who hadn't had a night's sleep in all that time, explained why. "You're not going to buck any army," he said. "They wouldn't have stood for it. They're like a bunch of animals." Oh. Here. Hmm. 17. Rapier. To seize, comma, enjoy hastily. Latin Dictionary. The Fresno Angels don't make news very often, but when they do, it is usually for something outlandish, some genuinely wretched affront to everything the squares hold dear. One of these was a brutal rape in a little town called Clovis, near Fresno, in the Central Valley. When the story hit the papers, the citizens were outraged for miles around. A 36-year-old widow and mother of 5 claimed she had been yanked out of a bar where she was having a quiet beer with another woman, then carried to an abandoned shack behind the bar, and raped repeatedly for 2.5 hours by 15 or 20 Hells Angels, and finally robbed of $150. That's how the story appeared in the San Francisco newspaper the next day. And I was kept alive for a few more days by the woman's claims. It was kept alive for a few more days by the woman's claims that she was getting phone calls threatening her life if she testified against her assailants. Then, 4 days after the crime, the victim was arrested on charges of sexual perversion. The story emerged, and the Clovis chief of police, when the woman was confronted by witnesses, the story emerged, said the Clovis chief of police, when the woman was confronted by witnesses. "Our investigation shows she was not raped," said the chief. "She participated in lewd acts in the tavern with at least 3 Hells Angels before the owners ordered them out. She encouraged their advances in the tavern, then led them to an abandoned house in the rear. She was not robbed, but according to a woman who'd accompanied her, had left her house early in the evening with $5 to go bar hopping. The incident did not appear in the Attorney General's report, but it is as valid as any that did, and it is one of the classic Hells Angels stories. The O. Henry Gimp in the plotline gives it real style. Somebody should have done a public opinion survey in Fresno, getting one set of reactions after the first version of the rape appeared, and another when the worm did a full turn. Like the Monterey rape, the Clovis outrage was one of these cases where the prosecuting attorneys would have fared better if their witnesses had been intimidated into silence. The Clovis story is amusing, not because of what happened, but because of the thundering disparity between accusation and reality. There was the rape mania, the old bugaboo, one of the big keys to the whole Hells Angels phenomenon. Nobody is objective about rape. It is a horror and a titillation and a mystery all at once. Women are terrified of being raped. But somewhere in the back of every womb there is one rebellious nerve, and that tingles with curiosity whenever the word is mentioned. This is even more terrifying, for it hints at basic depravity and secret lusts too dangerous to even think about. Men speak of rapists with loathing, and talk about their victims as if they carried some tragic brand. They are sympathetic, but always aware. Raped women have been divorced by their husbands, who couldn't bear to live with the awful knowledge, the visions, the possibilities that it wasn't really rape. There is the bone of it, the unspeakable mystery. Everybody has heard the joke about the lawyer who used a quill and an ink bottle to get his client acquitted on a rape charge. He told the jury there was no such thing as rape, and proved it by having a witness try to put the quill in the bottle, which he manipulated so deftly that the witness finally gave up. That sounds like one of Cotton Mather's jokes, or the wisdom of somebody very much like him, somebody who never had his arm bent up between his shoulder blades. Any lawyer who says there's no such thing as rape should be hauled out to a public place by 3 large perverts and buggered at high noon, with all his clients watching. California averages more than 3,000 reported cases of forcible rape every year, almost 3 a day. This would be a menacing statistic if it were not meaningless. In 1963, an average year, 3,058 forcible rapes were reported, but only 231 of these cases were brought to trial, and only 157 rapists were actually convicted. There is no way of knowing how many rapes were actually committed. Many went unreported, or were hushed up by victims who feared the publicity and possible humiliation of a public trial. Rape victims, concerned for their reputations, often refuse to press charges, and few prosecutors will compel them to testify. A rapist who confines his lust to middle and upper-class ladies is on pretty safe ground, but he is taking his life in his hands when he preys on women to whom the rape stigma has little meaning. Given a victim willing to testify in open court, an articulate prosecutor can recreate the attack in such vivid carnal detail that even the meekest defendant will appear to the jury as a depraved Hun. The small percentage of rape cases that come to trial would indicate that the state only tries those it feels sure of. Despite this, only 7 out of 10 California rape trials end in conviction, while the figure for all other felony trials is 8 out of 10. The rape mania is such a complex phenomenon that it will eventually have to be dealt with by presidential fiat. A blue ribbon commission will have to probe it, along with log rolling and fatback syndrome. Meanwhile, the Hells Angels will continue to be arrested for rape with monotonous regularity. It has come to be known as one of their specialities, particularly gang rape, the most painful and degrading kind of sex assault. Although most of the membership has been arrested for rape at one time or another, in 15 years less than half a dozen have been convicted. The outlaws insist they don't rape, but police say they do it continually. Convictions are hard to get, the cops say, because most women are reluctant to testify, and those few who are willing usually change their minds after the angels or some of the mamas threaten to cut them up or turn them out for the whole club. In July 1966, 4 angels went on trial in Sonoma County for the forcible rape at an angel party of a 19-year-old San Francisco model. 19 angels were charged, but the county attorney narrowed it down to 4. Terry, Tiny, Moldy Marvin, and Magoo II. And went into court with no doubt in his mind that he would get 4 convictions. 2 weeks later, after 3 angel defense attorneys had cross-examined the victim, a jury of 11 women and 1 man voted for acquittal. They needed less than 2 hours to reach a unanimous verdict. There was a certain amount of truth in the intimidation charges, but not nearly enough to explain why the angels are so often charged and seldom convicted. The biggest part of the truth lies in the problem of defining an act of rape in terms of what actually happened. Obviously, if a woman is jerked off the street and forced to commit fornication against her will, that is rape. Yet the angels say this never happens. Why take a chance on a 50-year rape rap, said one. Hell, rape's no fun anyway, not if it's real. And we get all the action we can handle just by standing around. Christ, I've had women proposition me at stoplights. I've had them open my fly in bars without even saying hello. And if nothing happens by accident, I just call around and find out who's horny. Sure, we'll take whatever we can get, said another. But I've never yet heard a girl yell rape until it was all over, and she got to thinking about it. Let's face it, a lot of women can't make it with just one guy at a time. They can't get their jollies. But the trouble is that sometimes a girl wants to stop before we do. Or maybe while she's taking on 15 guys in the back of a pickup truck, somebody heists a few bucks from her purse. So she flips her lid and brings the heat down on us. Or maybe we get rousted, and there she is all naked in the middle of a bunch of Hell's Angels. So suddenly she's been raped. What can we say? It's an automatic bust. But all we have to do is get a lawyer in her ear, tell her all the stuff that'll come out in court, and she decides to drop charges. Most of our rape raps never get to court. Never even get to court. There are stories, even in police records, of girls who freely admitted to making it with 2 or 3 angels and then trying to call a halt. What does a jury make of testimony to the effect that the first hump was for love, the next for kicks, and all the others were rape? An alleged rape victim in Oakland came to a bar one evening with an angel she had met the night before and proceeded to do him on a pool table in the back room. One of the others looked in, saw what was happening, and naturally stood by for seconds. The girl protested, but when her true lover threatened to punch her, she saw the light. After the third go, she realized that she was in for what she was in for and became hysterical, causing the bartender to summon the law. Another girl rode on a motorcycle up from Los Angeles and insisted on joining the club. The angels told her she could, but only if she showed some class. Man, what a nutty broad, said one. She came to the party the next night with a big St. Bernard dog, and what an act she put on. I tell you, it damn near blew my mind. He smiled wistfully. After that, she took on everybody. Christ, what a bitch she was. She went right out of her gourd when she realized we weren't going to let her join the club. She called us all kinds of shit. When she went out to a phone booth and rang for the cops. We all got busted for a rape, but we never heard nothing more about it because the broad split the next day. Nobody's seen her since. Whenever the word rape comes up, Harry the Tramp tells the story about the off-the-wall broad who rolled up to the El Adobe one night in a taxicab. A really fine-looking chick. She paid the cabbie and just stood there for a minute, looking at us. And then, man, she walked across the parking lot like she owned the place and asked us what the hell we were staring at. Then she started laughing. All right, she yelled out. I fuck, I suck, and I smoke a lot of dope, so let's get started. Wow, we couldn't believe it. By God, she wasn't lying. We put her in the back of the old panel truck we had then, and damn if she wasn't still yelling for more when the bar closed. We had to take her out to the country. The Angels are full of stories about girls who seek them out. They tend to embellish both the action and the girls, but few of the stories are made up out of thin air. After dozens of long nights with the Outlaws, I don't recall many when there wasn't at least one girl going down for the crowd, or whoever felt the sap rising. Usually they were mamas, but now and then what the Angels call a strange broad or new pussy would show up. Most of these seemed to be under the impression that they were with one of the Angels, and sometimes it worked out that way. The new pussy would dance a bit, drink a few beers, then roar off into the night with her Shane. Other girls, however, were taken into the panel truck and not seen again for many hours. With a few rare exceptions, the fact of some gang action in a nearby truck or back seat does not cause much of a stir. Of the 30 or so outlaws at the El Adobe on a weekend night, less than half would take the trouble to walk across the parking lot for a go at whatever Gench is available. A girl might be kept humping for hours, but only because a group of 10 or so will take several turns each. Any outlaw whose old lady is around will gallantly ignore the sex action. The wives and steady girlfriends won't stand for it. They don't actively resent the mamas, but they observe a rigid social barrier. One of the Oakland old ladies, a pretty dark-haired girl named Jean, thinks mamas are pretty sad people, born losers. I just feel sorry for the girls like Mama Beverly, she says. They think they have to put out and do anything at all just so they can be around guys like the Angels. But there are a lot of girls like that. One time at a party in Richmond, a girl nobody had ever seen came in and started showing around a nude picture of herself. Then she went in the back room with a dozen guys. Man, you want to see the girls who flock around when the Angels are on a run, and just because they're Angels. If any girl claims she was raped by the Angels, it was most likely because she came up and asked for it. That sounds a bit harsh. Invariably, the girls who pursue the Hells Angels are in the grip of some carnal urgency, and some are deranged sluts, but few really look forward to being gang raped. It is a very ugly experience. A fact the Angels tacitly admit by classifying it as a form of punishment. A girl who squeals on one of the outlaws or who deserts him for somebody wrong can expect to be turned out, as they say, to pull the angel train. Some of the boys will pick her up one night and take her to a house where the others are sitting around with not much else to do. It is a definite ceremony, like the purging of a witch. The girl is stripped, held down on the floor, and mounted by whoever has seniority. The punishment is administered in a place where everybody can watch, including the mamas and old ladies, although most of the Angel women are careful to avoid these shows. Not all the outlaws go for them either. The purging is usually done by the wronged angel and a handful of others with a taste for this kind of discipline. Every chapter has a few gangbang aficionados. They are usually the meanest of the lot. Not the toughest, but the ones who are unpredictably hostile, day and night, in all kinds of situations. At a party many months after I first met the angels, when they were taking my presence for granted, I came in on a scene that still hovers in my mind, somewhere between a friendly sex orgy and an all-out gang rape. It was not an angel party, but they had been invited, and 20 or so showed up for what turned into a 2-day bash. Almost immediately, several of the outlaws located a girl, the ex-wife of another guest, who agreed to make the beast with the two backs in a small building set apart from the main house, which she did, and happily so, with the chosen trio. But word quickly spread of the new mama, and soon she was surrounded by a large group of onlookers, drinking, laughing, and taking a quick turn whenever some vacancy occurred. I keep a crumpled yellow note from that night. Not all the writing is decipherable, but some of it reads like this. Pretty girl, about 25, lying on a wooden floor, two or three on her all the time, one kneeling between her legs, one sitting on her face, and somebody else holding her feet. Teeth and tongues and public hair, dim light in a wooden shack, sweat and semen gleaming on her thighs and stomach. Red and white dress pushed up around her chest, people standing around yelling, wearing no pants, waiting first, second or third turns, girl jerking and moaning, not fighting, clinging, seems drunk, incoherent, not knowing, drowning. It was not a particularly sexual scene. The impression I had at the time was one of vengeance. The atmosphere in the room was harsh and brittle, almost hysterical. Most people took a single turn, then either watched or wandered back to the party. But a hard core of 8 or 10 kept at her for several hours. In all, she was penetrated in various ways no less than 50 times, and probably more. At one point, when the action slowed down, some of the angels went out and got the girl's ex-husband, who was stumbling drunk. They led him into the shack and insisted he take his own turn. The room got nervous, for only a few of the outlaws were anxious to carry things that far. But the sight of her former old man brought the girl out of her daze just enough to break the silent tension. She leaned forward, resting on her elbows, and asked him to kiss her. He did, and then groggily took his turn, while the others cheered. Afterward, the girl rested for a while, and then wandered around the party in a blank sort of way and danced with several people. Later, she was taken back for another session. When she finally reappeared, I saw her trying to dance with her ex-husband, but all she could do was hang on his neck and sway back and forth. She didn't even seem to hear the music. A rock and roll band with a very swinging beat. What would a jury make of that one, presuming they could know all the facts, circumstances, and ramifications? If the girl was raped, why didn't she protest or ask somebody for help? The angels were vastly outnumbered, and it was not the sort of party they would have wanted to break up for the sake of a would-be mama. There was plenty of action around, and if anybody had protested the gangbang, the outlaws would have called it off. But nobody seemed bothered, and one or two of the non-angel guests finally joined in. The girl had several chances to leave the party and call the police, but that was out of the question. Girls who get turned out at a Hell's Angels parties don't think of police in terms of protection. But sex is only one aspect of rape's broader definition. The word derives from the Latin rapere, to take by force, and according to Webster, the contemporary translation ranges from 1. The crime of having sexual intercourse with a woman or girl forcibly and without her consent. 2. The act of seizing and carrying away by force. Or 3. To plunder or destroy, as in warfare. So the Hells Angels, by several definitions, including their own, are working rapists. And in this downhill half of our 20th century, they are not so different from the rest of us as they sometimes seem. They are only more obvious. '18. Now Bonnie and Clyde are the Barrow Gang. I'm sure you all have read how they rob and steal, and now those who squeal are usually found dying or dead. There are lots of untruths to their write-ups. They are not so merciless as that. They hate all the laws. The stool pigeons, spotters, and rats. They class them as cold-blooded killers. They say they are heartless and mean. But I say this with pride, that I once knew Clyde, when he was honest and upright and clean. Bonnie Barker, who had 9 notches on her pistol when Texas police finally did her in. Day and night, whoever crashed, he painted and burnt. But one day he crashed and was burnt and was also painted. But now he's off and running, strong. He doesn't hold a grudge, but please don't get him wrong, because if you crash, it will certainly be your ass. Poem found on a wall at a Hells Angels party. Nobody was raped at Willow Cove. The lack of strange broads drove most of the outlaws to drunken despair. And by the time I decided to sleep that night, there wasn't a sober human being in the camp. More than half of the 50 or so outlaws still standing around the bonfire had lost all contact with reality. Some just stood like zombies and stared vacantly at the flames. Others would brood for a while, then suddenly began shouting gibberish with echoes which echoed across the lake like the screaming of many loons. Now and then a cherry bomb would go off in the fire, blasting sparks and embers in all directions. Before I went under, I made sure to lock the car doors and roll the windows up far enough so that nobody could reach in. The Angels are hell on people who pass out at parties, and one of their proudest traditions is the sleepless night, first night of any run. Several times when I was looking for somebody, I was told, "He's hiding to crash." For a while, I thought the term had something to do with an overdose of brain ticklers, the maddened victim having slunk off in the woods like a sick animal, to ride out his delirium without disturbing the others. But crashing means nothing more sinister than going on the nod, either from booze or simple fatigue. When this happens, if the unfortunate has not found a safe hiding place, the others will immediately begin tormenting him. The most common penalty for crashing is the urine shower. Those still on their feet gather quietly around the sleeper and soak him from head to foot. Other penalties are more sophisticated. Moldy Marvin is widely admired for his work on crashers. He once wired Terry the Tramp to an electrical outlet, then soaked his Levi's with beer and plugged him in. Jimmy from Oakland. One of the quieter angels recalls crashing on a run to Sacramento and being set on fire. The bastards painted my glasses black, wrote all over me with lipstick, and then burned me, he says with a grin. Magoo once woke up at a party to find himself handcuffed, clamped in leg irons, and his 2 burning matchbooks in his lap. I begged somebody to piss on me, he said. Man, I was on fire. As dawn approached, there were less than 20 moving bodies in the camp. One of the jokers I'd been talking to earlier had become fascinated with the word shunt. It caught his ear when I referred to them having been shunted off to a bad campsite. He repeated the word with a grin, then went off to play with it for a while. Several hours later, I heard him urge another joker, "Say, man, let's go into town and shunt somebody." By 4 a.m, the word had grown like a tumor in his consciousness, and he wandered around the fire, buttonholing people and asking, "What would you do if I said I was going to shunt you?" Or, "Say, man, can you lend me some shunt until morning? I'm hurting." Then he would laugh distractedly and stagger off toward the remains of the beer mountain, which by that time was built almost entirely of empties. Now and then one of the outlaws, unable to find a full can, would fly into a rage and start kicking the empties in all directions until somebody came to help him. And behind all the other sounds, as always, was the revving and booming of motorcycle engines. Some of the angels would sit on their bikes for a while, letting them idle, then kill the engine and move out again to socialize. It seemed to give them new energy, like a battery charge. The last sound I heard that night was the peaceful idling of a hog right next to the car. The next morning I woke up to the same noise, but this time it was deafening. Apparently some enemy had crept in during the night and screwed every one of the carburetor adjustments, causing them all to need returning. There was a big crowd by the still smoking bonfire, and in the middle of it I could see Barger talking to a bald little man who seemed to have the St. Vitus dance. He was a reporter from the Los Angeles Times, and he was very much on edge, even though there were several deputies in camp. He was writhing and sweating like a man who'd burst into a cannibal fort to ask for the chief's daughter. He introduced himself as Jerry Cohen. Just as he started to explain what he wanted, Tiny rushed up to Barger, threw his arms around him, and planted a sloppy wet kiss on his mouth. This is a guaranteed square jolter, and the angels are gleefully aware of the reaction it gets. "They can't stand it," said Sterry. "It blows their minds every time, especially the tongue bit." The sight of a photographer invariably whips the angels into a kissing frenzy. But I have never seen them do it among themselves, when there was nobody around to shock. There is an element of something besides showbiz to it that in serious moments now and then, one of the angels will explain it as just one of the ways that we let the world know we're brothers. It is an unnerving way to be greeted, One night after I'd known the Angels for many months, I walked into the Hyatt Inn in San Francisco and joined a cluster at the bar. While I was reaching in my pocket for some beer money, I was nearly knocked off my feet by a flying body that wrapped itself around me before I could see who it was. Everything went black. My first thought was that they'd finally turned on me, and it was all over. Then I felt the hairy kiss and heard the laughter. Ronnie, the Oakland secretary, seemed offended that I hadn't caught him in midair, and he'd expected and returned the kiss heartily. It was a serious social error and further proof to the outlaws that I was only about half bright. They considered me a slow learner, a borderline case with only splinters of real potential. My first plunge into folly was getting a limey bike, an insult that I only partially redeemed by destroying it in a high-speed crash and laying my head open. The wreck gave me a kind of minimum status that lasted until I blew the kissing act. After that, they treated me with a gentle sort of detachment, as if I were somebody's little brother with an incurable disease. Let the poor fool have his way. God knows it's the least we can do for him. They treated the Los Angeles man the same way, but he never seemed to get over the feeling that somebody was going to sneak up behind him and scramble his brains with the tire iron. It was a very funny scene. I was hoping Cohen would utter something like, "President Barger, I presume?" But he was too nervous. He'd been talking to the cops, and his mind was full of atrocity stories. Probably he was even then composing the article. Somebody else would write on his demise. The reporter struggled, but to no avail. The drug-crazed cyclists quickly hacked him into quarters, which they put on a spit. Their orgiastic cries floated across the water. He is survived by... The odd truth is that Cohen left Bass Lake with one of the longest and strangest interviews Barger has ever given anybody. The boss angel was in rare spirits that morning. The sun was warm, his people were secure, and whatever he'd got hold of the night before had obviously been good for him. Cohen's demeanor was anything but hostile. Most reporters either patronize the outlaws or ask such pointed, opinionated questions that they would do just as well to get their answers from the Lynch report. One night in Oakland, I watched a man from one of the East Bay papers make both mistakes at once. He came into the El Adobe and immediately asked to buy some marijuana. When before they could decide whether he was a poisoned toad or a narco agent, he pulled out some grass of his own and offered it around. This didn't work either, although it might have broken the ice if he'd rolled a joint for himself. Then he offered to buy a round of beers, talking constantly in pop jargon. The Angels tolerated him for a while, but after several beers he began asking questions about Hitler and gang rapes and sodomy. Finally, Sonny told him he had 30 seconds to get his ass out of sight, and if he showed up again, they would work on his head with a chain. Another journalist was 86th for being too sympathetic. There's something creepy about that guy, Barger told me. He's either a cop or he's crazy. And if it's neither one of those, then he's using us for something we don't know nothing about. Which proved to be true. His relationship with the Angels went from uneasy to critical. And the last time I talked to him, he said that they were after him for real. He was so worried that he'd bought a .357 Magnum revolver. "You're damn right I'm scared," he said. "If they come around here, I'll shoot to kill." This seemed to satisfy the Angels. The nutty Son of a bitch was looking for a scare, said one. Maybe it'll straighten him out. Cohen made none of these mistakes. He asked very short, general questions, and then stood quietly, sweating and shuffling, while his tape recorder gathered up the answers. I could almost hear the song when Barger led off with, "We angels live in our own world. We just want to be left alone, to be individualists." Here are some other jewels that Cohen collected that morning, nearly all from Barger. Actually, we're conformists. To be an angel, you have to conform to the rules of our society. And the angels' rules are the toughest anywhere. Our bikes are first with us. We can do things with bikes that nobody else can do. They can try, but they can't. An angel can tear a hog down and put it back together in 2 hours. Who else can? This stuff, the Nazi insignia and headgear, that's just to shock people, to let them know we're individualists, to let them know we're angels. There'd be no trouble if we was left alone. The only violence is when people go after us. A couple of angels will get into a bar, and a few guys getting drunked up, will start a fight. And we get blamed for it. Our 2 guys will put them down. Any 2 angels can take on any other 5 guys. You got to want to be an angel. We don't just take anybody in. We watch them. We got to know they'll stick to our rules. Barger talked steadily for nearly an hour, fully aware that he was being taped and photographed. In that respect, it was the end of an era, for soon afterward he realized that the wisdom he dispensed and the poses he struck for the cameras were worth money. And by the time the article appeared, his expansive mood had turned to gall. The rest of the stay at Bass Lake was relatively peaceful. Many of the angels spent Sunday afternoon at the beer market, performing for an overflow crowd of tourists. They poured beer on each other, exchanged lewd chatter with the citizens, and had a fine time keeping everybody on edge. Old men bought beer for them. Middle-aged women called out insulting questions, and the cash register clanged merrily. Back at camp, there were moments of tension when the Willow Cove Inlet was invaded by 3 big hydroplanes full of Muscle Beach types and bikini girls. They weren't necessarily looking for a fight, but they came on strong, as one of the angels put it, and for a while it looked as if something bad was building up. The police had made no provisions for staving off an attack by water, and when the hydroplanes arrived, there was no deputies in camp. There were no deputies in camp. The men on the boats were all in their 20s, wearing bright form-fit trunks with deep tans and short waxed hair that stayed combed even in the water. There were about 20 male specimens and 5 or 6 girls who looked like something off the French Riviera. They tied up the boats to some trees across the inlet from the outlaw camp and began to play around lazily, diving, tossing the girls around, passing beer back and forth, but ignoring the outlaws completely. 100 feet away on the other side of the inlet, the Hells Angels lounged in all their grubby splendor. There were no suntans, bikinis, or waterproof watches on that side. The outlaws stood on the rocky beach in jockey shorts, with wet Levi's and matted beards that made their skin seem pale and moldy. Several were splashing around in the water with their clothes on. Some of the girls wore bras and panties. Others rolled up their corridor pants as high as they would go. And a few were swimming in men's t-shirts. It looked like the annual picnic for the graveyard shift at the Never Sweat copper mine in Butte, Montana. The Angels didn't do much swimming. It doesn't fit their style, and only a few know how. Shit, I'd sink like a stone if I went in that water, said one. I guess I could learn to swim if I wanted to, but what the hell? I wouldn't do it more than once a year, anyhow. Finally, after some roosterish banter, some of the Muscle Beach people swam gracefully across the inlet to answer questions the Angels had been yelling about the boats. They wanted to know about the engines, which looked so big that the outlaws couldn't understand why they didn't sink the holes they were mounted in. One was a 400 horsepower Oldsmobile V8 with a supercharger. This was the only common language the two groups had, but it served. After a half hour of shop talk and a few shared beers, one of the boat boys offered to take some of the Angels for a spin. They came back laughing excitedly. Man, that thing did a big wheelie across the lake, said one. I couldn't believe it. That thing's out of sight. The only other incident of the run occurred on Sunday night, just before the beer market closed at 10. The Angels, who'd been there all day, were totally drunk when it came time to go, but they insisted on doing it upright. Whenever they exited in a group, drunk or sober, they boom off like a flight of jet fighters, leaving a runway, one at a time, in rapid succession, and with overwhelming noise. The basic idea is that individual launches keep them from running into each other, but the Angels have developed the ritual to the realm of high drama. The order of departure doesn't matter, but the style and rhythm are crucial. They carefully prime their carburetors so the bikes will start on the first kick. An outlaw whose hog won't leap off like a thunderbolt feels a real stigma. It has the same effect as a gun jamming in combat, or an actor blowing a key line. To be or not to be, quoth the raven. This is about the way it went at the beer market. A big crowd gathered in the driveway to watch the finale. A photographer rushed around frantically, flashing his strobe light every few seconds, but the Angels were too drunk to carry it off. Some of them flooded their carburetors, then raged and cursed as they jumped repeatedly on the kickstarters. Others went careening off simultaneously or veered into the crowd with wild yells. Many were carrying six-packs, which made control even more difficult. Those who'd flooded on the first launch tried to atone for it by screeching off on one wheel, gunning their engines mercilessly to get up ahead of steam before springing the clutch. Buck, a massive joker, crashed into a police car before he got out of first gear and was taken straight to jail, where he spent the next 30 days. Fripp from Oakland went flying off the road and hit a tree, breaking his ankle and blocking traffic on the narrow lakeside road. A large crowd gathered, all wanting to help. The only cop on the scene was a Madera County Sheriff's deputy in a paddy wagon, but he claimed to have no authority and refused to call a private ambulance until somebody signed an agreement to pay the bill. This drew jeers and protests from the crowd. The photographer lost his head and began to curse the deputy. One of the 4 or 5 Angels on the scene went roaring off toward Willow Cove. Finally, the photographer said he'd pay the ambulance bill, and the deputy made the call. Moments later, 2 helmeted deputies rushed onto the scene, each with a German Shepherd on a leash. There was a flurry of yelling and pushing as people tried to get away from the dogs. A siren wailed somewhere down the road, but the police cars couldn't get through the traffic jam. Some cops left their cars and ran toward whatever was happening, waving their clubs and shouting, "Stand back! Stand back!" Barger's scout party arrived seconds behind the police. But they weren't stopped by the traffic. As they weaved between cars, their headlights jerked around crazily, adding a new element of menace to the scene. I caught a glimpse of Barger shoving through the crowd toward the injured Angel. One of the helmeted cops reached out to stop him and was knocked about 6 feet up the road by Dirty Ed. I saw Ed coming, but I couldn't believe my eyes. The cop must have had the same feeling. Dirty Ed hit him on the run and grabbed the front of his jacket at the same time. The cop looked startled as he reeled backward, trying to swing his club. One of the deputies jumped Ed, and the two had a brief wrestling match before the photographer tried to pull them apart. Then, for reasons we can only speculate on, the cops seized the photographer instead of the Angel. 2 handlers from the Kern County Canine Patrol got him in a double arm lock, ignoring his piteous screams, and slammed him repeatedly against a dirt cliff until he lost his voice. He was then put in the paddy wagon. In the meantime, Sheriff Baxter had arrived and was trying to calm things down. He found Barger and assured him that an ambulance was coming for his boy. This appeared to solve things, although Sonny and a dozen other Angels stayed until Fripp was packed off to a hospital. Dirty Ed lurked quietly in the background, looking dangerous but not making any violent moves. The police ignored him, but Tiny Baxter went over to the paddy wagon and began screaming like a cheetah at the luckless photographer inside, accusing him of trying to set off a riot. "You crazy son of a bitch. I ought to come in there and break your goddamn head," he yelled. And for a moment I thought he would. All the tension of the weekend was pounding in his voice as he berated the only enemy he could find who didn't have allies. Grabbing Dirty Ed would have been like lighting a fuse. But the photographer was as harmless as a punching bag. He had no army to back him up, to avenge him if anything happened. And to make matters worse, he admitted being a freelancer, a term most police interpret to mean a bum who can't even get a job. If they'd grabbed me that night, I'd have admitted to being an enforcer for the opium tong before saying I was a freelance writer. Police are always more careful with people who are employed, even by the tong. The only thing better is a wallet full of high-toned credentials. Membership cards, all kinds of them, covered with filigreed wording and strange codes alluding to firm connections with various power combines and seats of influence that no smart cop should cross. Unfortunately, the photographer had none of these, so he was kept in jail for 3 days, fined $167 for obstructing justice, and released with a warning to keep out of Madera County for the rest of his natural life. Before being taken away, he gave the keys to his new Sunbeam Roadster. He gave me the keys to his new Sunbeam Roadster and said he had $2,000 worth of camera equipment in the trunk. He didn't know me at all, and certainly there was nothing in my scraggy appearance to indicate that I would do anything but sell both the car and the equipment at the first opportunity. But he was not in a solid position. His only alternative was to let the car sit on the road for 3 days. Luckily, he had picked up 2 hitchhikers earlier in the day, who said they'd hopped a freight from Los Angeles up to Fresno, and then set out by thumb to see what was happening with the Hells Angels. They agreed to drive the Sunbeam down to Madera, where the photographer was taken for booking. For some reason, they followed me right to jail. They could have fled down any side road. Nobody knew their names or where they might go, and the owner of the car was not in any position to start filing complaints. At the jail, we were told that nobody could speak to the prisoner until his bail had been posted. It was $275, and the only bondsman available refused to touch the case. He said there were too many bums running around loose that weekend. They parked the Sunbeam on the street, and while one went inside to give the keys to the desk sergeant, a cop who'd been at the accident drove up and said I was going to be arrested for vagrancy the next time he laid eyes on me. It didn't seem worth arguing about, so I dropped the hitchhikers on 101 and drove north for about an hour until I was sure the Madera County line was somewhere behind me. Then I found a back road next to an airport and went to sleep. The next morning I thought about going back to Bass Lake, but I didn't. Feel like spending the day scrounging beers and listening to the same dull noise. I ate breakfast with a bunch of farmers in a diner on 101, then drove on to San Francisco. The holiday traffic was slow, but the only real bottleneck was in Tracy, where a large crowd had turned out for a hot rod show, somewhere west of Oakland. Somewhere west of Oakland. I picked up two boys who said they were running away from a Job Corps camp. They didn't know exactly where they wanted to go, but one of them said he had a cousin up in the coast in Ukiah. And they said, and they thought they'd go there for a while. I gave them a pack of cigarettes and let them off at a stoplight in Oakland. Monday morning's newspapers were full of riot stories. The Los Angeles Times ran a king-size 8-column headline, "Holiday Rioting, Tear Gas, Troops Quell Youths, 4 resorts in Midwest disrupted by battles of crowds and police." A front-page story in the New York Times said, "Youth riots erupt in 3 states. 25 hurt, 325 held. Overnight outbreaks engulf 4 resorts. 200 seized in Lake George turmoil." It seemed like the only people who hadn't erupted on the 4th of July were the Hells Angels. Both San Francisco papers took note of this. A Chronicle headline said, "Hells Angels front all quiet." But the Examiner gave the screw an extra turn. "Cops clip wings of angels. Meek cyclists quit Madeira." The only motorcycle story was a United Press dispatch from Sioux County, Iowa. It was very brief. A 30-member motorcycle gang called the Outlaw Club of the Midwest left the city of 90.5 thousand today after harassing its citizens over the holiday weekend. They blocked traffic, rode on sidewalks, and played hide-and-seek with squad cars. A spokesman for the gang said they came to Sioux City to give it a little class. The Chronicle story on the Angels said police in Madera County were still undecided on what to do about the restraining order. Apparently, something had gone haywire, for the order called for the Angels to appear in Madera County Superior Court on July 16th, or be permanently barred from the county. Police feared there might be trouble, said the article, because the gang threatened to remain in Bass Lake until July 16th, or return on that date with reinforcements. County officials were faced with a choice between dismissing the order entirely or hosting another run, and Barger said they'd had every intention of going back to argue their case. Needless to say, the order was done away with. It had been a bummer from the start, and not even the cops charged with enforcing it knew what it meant. The final press comment on the Bass Lake saga appeared in the Examiner under a small headline, "A Victory for Hells Angels." It said the order had been dismissed at the request of the district attorney, the same man who'd hatched it 2 weeks earlier. In retrospect, there was unanimous agreement that both the press and the police had done a spectacular job. There was massive publicity, a massive police presence, and massive beer drinking to justify all their concern. In a galaxy of nationwide riots and civic upheaval, Bass Lake was a star of peace. There were various explanations, some with ominous overtones. One of them came from a police official who attributed the lack of violence to the fact that there were almost as many officers as cyclists. He estimated the Bass Lake Task Force had more than 100, all working overtime. The Angels had their own explanation. They belittled the idea that the cops had simply outmuscled them. Not at all. But the fact of sheer numbers, they had forced both the cops and the citizens to leave them alone. Both sides claimed their own show of force had averted a crisis. And to a certain extent, they were both right. But I think the real explanation was more complex. It was the strange ambivalence of the public sentiment that kept the Bass Lake confrontation so precariously balanced all weekend. It confused the Angels almost as badly as it did the police. They arrived to face a solid front of civic outrage, and then, for no reason they could hope to understand, they became the weekend's featured act, the main show, wild and randy proof that Bass Lake still knew how to put on a real 4th of July pageant. The threat of violence was converted to dramatic tension. It put a definite zang in the air. The mood of the crowd was euphoric, even erotic. There were incidents, but not many. And when it was all over, the most serious events of the weekend was laid to a photographer from Los Angeles. If nothing else, the weekend was a monument to free enterprise. It's hard to say what might have happened if the outlaws hadn't been able to buy beer. But the moon-faced man at the tourist market was the visionary who turned the tide. After the first purchase, the Angels were welcome, or at least tolerated, everywhere except at Williams's store, which even the vigilantes abandoned when it became apparent that the action was across the lake. Poor Williams was left holding the civic bag. He had taken a gutty stand. His image was all moxie. And on Monday night, when the Angels were finally gone, he had earned the leisure that enabled him to go out to the lakefront and gaze off in a proud, wistful way, like Gatsby, at the green neon lights of the tavern across the water, where the others were counting their money. Next section is titled The Dope Kabbalah in a Wall of Fire.